In the late autumn of 1944, a shadow slipped out of the Yokosuka Naval Shipyard under the cover of a moonless night. This was not just another warship. It was the Shinano, a leviathan of 72,000 tons, stretching nearly 850 feet from bow to stern. She was, at that precise moment, the largest and most heavily armored aircraft carrier ever constructed in human history. Born from the hull of a giant Yamato-class battleship, her flight deck was protected by 3 inches of premium steel, specifically engineered to withstand direct hits from heavy Allied bombs. She was supposed to be a floating fortress, an unsinkable airfield that would turn the tide of the war in the Pacific. Yet, less than 24 hours later, this steel monster would lie dead at the bottom of the ocean, not destroyed by a massive fleet or an armada of aircraft, but brought down by a single American submarine and a chain of breathtakingly stupid mistakes. The tragedy of the Shinano began long before she ever tasted salt water. By 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy was in a state of absolute desperation. The disastrous defeat at Midway and the meat grinder of the Solomon Islands had wiped out Japan's elite carrier fleet. They didn't need more battleships, they needed decks to launch planes. So, the military command looked at the unfinished third hull of the Yamato-class super battleships and made a radical decision: convert it into a supercarrier. But as the American B-29 bombers began to rain fire on Tokyo, panic set in. The shipyard workers were forced into brutal 16-hour shifts. The ship was rushed. Quality control evaporated. To make matters worse, a freak accident occurred during her floating out ceremony when a dry dock gate failed, causing a massive rush of water that slammed the giant hull into the dock walls. Superstitious sailors whispered that the ship was cursed, an omen of the disaster to come, despite being heavily unfinished. With hundreds of civilian workers still on board trying to install wiring, pumps, and fire suppression systems, the Shinano was ordered to flee Yokosuka. Her destination was the safer waters of Kure, where she could finally be completed. Under the command of Captain Toshio Abe, a traditional officer who had never commanded a carrier before, the giant ship set sail on November 28. Her crew was a chaotic mixture of raw recruits, civilian technicians, and survivors from other sunken warships who had never trained together. They didn't know the layout of the ship, the watertight doors had never been properly tested, and most of the internal bulkheads were missing vital rubber seals. The massive carrier was essentially a giant, hollow labyrinth of steel, held together by rushed welds and desperate hopes. Escorted by 3 destroyers, the Shinano steamed into the dark Pacific, zigzagging to avoid Allied submarines. But fortune was not on Japan's side that night. Lurking nearby on the surface was the USS Archerfish, a BattleShip-class submarine commanded by Joseph Enright. Initially, the Archerfish's radar picked up a massive surface contact that Enright believed was a large island, or a tanker. When the submarine closed the distance, the crew was stunned to realize they were looking at a massive warship moving through the dark. For 6 grueling hours, a deadly game of cat and mouse played out. The Archerfish couldn't match the Shinano's top speed on the surface, and it seemed the giant carrier would easily leave the submarine behind. This is where arrogance and paranoia sealed the fate of the Japanese supercarrier. Captain Abe noticed the submarine's radar signals. Instead of using his 3 destroyers to hunt down and destroy the lone American intruder, Abe panicked. He believed the Archerfish was part of a massive American submarine wolf pack, sent specifically to ambush his secret ship. He ordered his escorts to hold their positions close to the carrier, forbidding them from chasing the submarine. Then, disaster struck the Shinano's machinery. One of her main propeller shafts began to overheat, forcing the massive vessel to slow down from 27 knots to just 18. Soon after, the carrier made a sharp turn to continue her zigzag pattern, a turn that put her directly into the firing line of the patiently waiting Archerfish. At 3:17 a.m., Commander Enright gave the order. 6 torpedoes streaked through the water, aimed at the massive silhouette. 4 of them slammed into the starboard side of the Shinano. The explosions ripped through the thin steel below the main armor belt, tearing into the engine rooms and crew quarters. On a fully completed ship, 4 torpedo hits would have been a serious blow, but certainly not a fatal one for a vessel built on a Yamato-class hull. In fact, on the bridge, Captain Abe and his officers barely felt the impact. They looked at the massive armor specifications and assumed the ship was safe. Abe confidently ordered the fleet to maintain speed, believing the internal pumps would easily handle the water. It was a fatal miscalculation. Deep inside the bowels of the ship, a nightmare was unfolding, because the civilian workers had not finished sealing the holes where electrical cables and pipes passed through the walls. The water didn't stay in the damaged compartments. It began to cascade freely from one room to the next, bypassed the unsealed watertight doors, and flooded into adjacent spaces. The raw, untrained crew didn't know how to operate the complex flooding control valves. When they tried to use the emergency pumps, they discovered that the pumps hadn't even been connected to the power grid yet. Manual bucket brigades were organized, but trying to empty a 70,000-ton ship with buckets was like trying to drain an ocean with a spoon. To make things even worse, the ship's engineering team made a catastrophic error in judgment. In a desperate attempt to counteract the growing list to the starboard side, they ordered the port side compartments to be deliberately flooded. However, without proper communication or monitoring, they flooded too much water too quickly, causing the ship to lose its remaining stability. As the night turned to morning, the Shinano's engines died completely. The giant carrier lay dead in the water, tilting farther and farther into the freezing ocean. Panic erupted on deck. The civilian shipyard workers, realizing the ship was doomed, stampeded towards the upper decks, blocking the sailors who were trying to fight the fires and flooding. By 10 a.m., the list reached a catastrophic 20 degrees. Captain Abe finally accepted reality and gave the order to abandon ship. The scene was pure chaos. The giant flight deck was now a steep, slippery steel cliff. Men slid down the armor plates, falling into the crushing machinery and the churning water below. At 10:57 a.m., just 17 hours after leaving port on her maiden voyage, the Shinano capsized completely, her massive red bottom exposed to the sky. She paused for a brief moment before sliding stern-first into the depths of the Pacific, taking more than 1,400 sailors, officers, and civilians with her, including Captain Abe. The loss of the Shinano remains the largest single-ship disaster caused by a submarine in naval history. It was a tragedy born not from superior enemy firepower, but from the hubris of a desperate command, a completely untrained crew, and the fatal decision to send an unfinished, unsealed ship into a war zone. The ultimate supercarrier, built to save an empire, ended its journey without ever launching a single combat aircraft or firing a single shot at the enemy, a monument to the foolishness of wartime desperation.